most desirable country to be posted. So we don't have to send our HR managers over to entice them. They are coming over and asking for jobs. The most desired place to be relocated. Now, the full tax exemption applies to newly incorporated companies. So the first 100,000 will be fully exempt. And the intention of that was to encourage individuals to be entrepreneurial. But when a scheme gets too good, a lot of people take advantage of it. And of course, I think a lot of the members here also took on the creative hat and advise your client how to maximize the full tax exemption. But the government has stepped in and said, well, this should not apply to investment holding companies, should not apply to property developers. Okay? So for property developers, investment holding companies incorporated after budget day, full exemption will not be applicable. And I think that is the correct move. In fact, I would even want to tighten up the partial exemption because there are groups that are setting up unnecessary companies to take advantage of the partial exemption. Okay? But I think not good for IRAS, but good for ICPAS because we have more companies to incorporate, more audit fees, more tax compliance fees. So no need to compete on low fees, raise your fees. So much for corporate tax. I'll move on to personal tax. Well, again, perpetually people clamor for reduction in individual tax. So the most favorite proposition was, well, if you don't reduce it to as competitive as Hong Kong, at least equate it with corporate tax. Because traditionally, corporate tax and income tax had the same highest tax rate. So I think very few of you looking around would remember that not that long ago. For me, it's not long ago because when the older you get, recent means the last 10 years, right? So for all of you, maybe recent last 2 months. Corporate tax was 40% in 1986. So we've come down a long way. Individual tax from 40% has now come down to 20%. So even though there is no decrease in tax rate, as with corporate tax, there is a 30% rebate for 2013. And the good news is for people over 60, the rebate is 50%, but kept at 1,005. So it is a generous rebate. People will say, well, 1,005 is not that much. I'll show you 1,005 is actually quite a lot. Because for me now that I'm retired, 1,005 will see me through 3 months. Because I'm very cheapskate. I buy a loaf of bread and eat for 2 days. Now, if you look at the effective tax rate for a person earning 200,000, married with 2 children, our effective tax rate is 8.69, say 8.7, very low, at 200,000. Compared with Hong Kong, where people say Hong Kong is lower, even at 200,000, Hong Kong is 11.04%. Most countries hover in the mid-20s, and way up there is UK at 30%. I did not put France down because France will be higher. And if you look at higher income, it will even be higher. Our tax rate, this is a table. But when we look at the rebate, for someone below 50, the maximum rebate, 1,005. His income is 112,000. So it's actually pitched at higher middle income people when they look at the 1,005 rebate. Okay, so they're actually looking and knowing, understanding that the middle income group is squeezed, so that, well, we allow the middle income group to maximize the rebates. Okay, so people did not factor in that amount, so it's actually quite high. And for people over 60, to maximize on your rebate, your income is close to 90,000. Again, quite a high level for retired, semi-retired people. Okay, and if you're over 60 and you're paying tax at 20%, you should buy me a glass of wine to celebrate, because you're doing extremely well. Now, some bad news, but this mainly concerns expatriate. At the moment, when they are provided with accommodation, the amount accessible is the lower of 10% of emolument or the annual value. But with effect from YA15, i.e. from next year, because this year, calendar 13 is YA14, so this will kick in next year. The full annual value becomes taxable. It makes a lot of difference. But I think most of you do not have accommodation provided by employer, so you are not involved. But for those with accommodation provided by employer, they are quite hard hit. Hotel at the moment, if you're provided with hotel by your employer, usually on arrival in Singapore, the amount accessible is $250 per month, not per day, plus 2% base pay for that period of occupation. Now, if you look at hotel rates, $250, you can't even pay for hotel rates per day, and they are assessing you $250 per month. Okay, so it's a very low rate. So low that now they say, well, hang on, it's too low. Expats are streaming in, let's tax them. And I agree with that. Give it back to citizens, tax the expats, right? And this is also effective from YA15. Furniture and fixtures, now we are computing it based on itemized amounts. So aircon, cooker, TV, we have to itemize them and then compute them on a month, multiply by 12. Quite a tedious process. But actually, those of you filing individual tax, you nod your head and say, yeah, it's tedious. But you forget, when it's tedious, you can charge your client more. But the bad news is the government is going to make it easy. When it's easy, your client will say, well, it's so simple, how come you charge me so much? So you must have some ways to tell them, actually, it's quite complex, the formula. So it will, from YA05, be a percentage of annual value. We don't know what the annual percentage is, but my guess is it should be around 10%. My guess of 10% is arrived at looking at typical leases, right? If you sign a lease, the rental is 10,000. Usually the rental was total rental 10,000, for the condo 8,000, furniture 2,000. I have not seen a lease where the amount attributable to rental of furniture and fixtures is below 10%. So my guess is 10, but I think some of the big four say should be 5%. But let's see. They may even go up to 20%, or actual rental, whichever is the higher. Now, I'm comparing what is happening now and what will happen in 2015. So I'm using someone paid reasonably well, salary 15,000, so annualized 180, 4 months bonus, and employer provides rental, costing the employer 10,000 a month. and say we itemize the furniture and calculated the benefit to be $200 a month, and the annual value of that property is $96,000. So currently, the benefit of furniture and fixtures will be added in to give us 242,400, and 10% of that will be accommodation benefit, because that 10% is lower than the annual value of 96, because currently we take the lower of 10% or AV, right? But in 2015, the full AV becomes taxable. And I'm speculating that furniture and fixtures amount taxable is 10%, so now the total amount accessible goes up to 5,600. Okay, so substantial increase. And the rationale for that is a lot of the times when expats come in, even though companies do not provide for housing, they can repackage their emolument such that housing is provided to take advantage of the 10% benefit. So from next year onwards, this advantage will be taken away. In the late 90s, early 2000s, award of stock options were very prevalent, very popular. So the government came up with special exemption schemes for them, the startup schemes, the company scheme, and the SME scheme, right? Now options are getting less popular, and they will allow the option schemes, all these special schemes, to expire. However, if you're granted options before budget day, the schemes, the startup schemes, SME schemes will be grandfathered from until 2023 for 10 years, because these schemes are good for 10 years. Let's look at other developments. Well, Minister talked about wage credit scheme, so it is one of the hot topic in the budget. So basically 40% of which increase will be subsidized by the government for 3 years, and the salary ceiling is 4,000. The reason for 4,000 is this is the mean income for household in Singapore. So as well, if you are drawing below that, the government is prepared to fund the increase at 40%. So my chart here shows how the costs of the increase can be reduced by the funding. So the base will be 2012, so if the base we have salary of 1,000, and we have $100 increase. $100 increase, 40% funded. So the costs to the employer is 1,060. 2014, now employee is good, you increase $200 this time. So 1,003, but we will compare with the base year of 1,000. So the increase is $300, 40% funded. So $120. Costs to employer 1,180. Year after, company is doing very well. Another $300 increase. Now the total increase is $600 compared with base year. So 40%, 240 is funded. So you can see from this simple chart that the wage credit scheme is a very generous scheme. To me, I look at the wage credit scheme different from the minister. I look at it from the fact that actually the government knows with the tightening of foreign labor, there will be wage pressures on employers. So you have no choice but to increase your wages. But knowing that, and the government knows, well, people will start talking, look, my wages have gone up. They are saying, well, it doesn't matter, we'll fund 40% of this increase. Well, people say, well, it doesn't mean that my employees become productive. Well, if I was to look at a 3-year time period, and if I was to do business, I certainly hope that within 3 years, I can encourage my employees to be more productive. So the onus is actually on the business people to motivate, because I always believe that a happy worker is a productive worker. Right? So once in a while, buy them wine, tell them jokes. So when they are doing their production, they laugh, they produce more. But the wage credit is taxable. So what I've done in this chart is factor in that we have to be taxed on the wage credit, and I'm using 17%. So with the tax factor coming in, the cost of funding is still quite substantial. In the third year, a shade below $200. Okay, still a very substantial subsidy. CPF, again, reason for me liking this budget is the government is actually looking at lower income group, okay, and paying attention to lower income group, because if you look back at the last 10 years budget, they had always been looking at business sector, how to make ourselves attractive, and they forget about the lower income group. So that's why I'm very happy with this budget. A lot of focus is concentrated on the lower income group. So now the intention is move the contribution by the employer up to the normal contribution rate of 16%. Before that, if you're earning below 500, you don't have to contribute. Initially, it was changed because at that time, the government wanted to have companies continue to employ workers. But I think they forget that companies will always complain. Right? When they spend $1, they complain. So now, I think it's good, and also we have to bear in mind, this is important. I honestly feel the lower income group, the lowest 10%, they are facing very tough life in Singapore. Vehicles, I think a lot of you complain. I drive, but I don't complain. Because I honestly feel in Singapore, a car is a luxury. And in any capitalistic society, you pay for your luxury. Right? So when I was reading, this is an aspirational need for young people. Why do we aspire to drive a car? So something I couldn't understand, they call this the generation gap. Now, commercial vehicles, 30% rebate, so recognition is given that, well, we have to help businesses some of the ways. And also extendable COE, so 5 plus 5 instead of 5 and full stop. But this I don't like, because at the moment, you already see a lot of commercial vehicles broken down, especially in expressway. And when you see 20-year-old trucks driving along expressway, there will be more breakdowns. So to me, this is a bad move. OMV for cars going up. So as I say, you pay for your luxury. So this is actually, I think, a good move, but I feel it's not aggressive enough. I feel it should be 50% there and 250% there. Because if you can drive a Lamborghini at the moment, well, not so much, 1.2 million, you can afford to pay a higher ARF. And in fact, if we increase OMV to 250%, maybe more people will buy Lamborghinis because it's more luxurious. Yes, instead of 1.3 million, now I'm driving a $1.5 million car. Property tax, this is interesting. The property tax increase involves owner-occupied properties as well as non-owner-occupied properties. So currently, for owner-occupied properties, we have 3 rates, 0% for AV of up to 6,000, and then the next 59,000 at 4%. So, and any excess over 65,000 at 6%. Currently, I don't pay property tax because I stay in a one-room HDB flat, AV $1,000, so I don't pay. Next year, instead of just top rate of 6%, property tax at the highest level goes to 15%. I only see a few worried faces. AV in excess of 130,000, that's a lot. Because I would think 90% of properties would be between 0 and 4. Okay? Because if we look at the first 55,000 AV, 55,000, you stay in a reasonable condo, probably your AV would be about 30,000. 5-room flat maybe about 20,000. Okay? So when we're talking about 130,000, you're talking about bungalows, good class bungalows. So if you can afford to stay in a 20,000 square foot bungalow, 15% is not a lot. Yes, honestly, it's not a lot. And from 2015, it will go to 16%. So that's actually a very hefty increase from now 6% to 16%. Very hefty increase. If you look at it from percentage terms, it's an increase of about 160%, right? 6 to 16. But I think this is a good move because the government has been giving away too much to the very high income group for the last few years. And one of the moves that I think should not have been done was the abolition of the annual value. Okay? Previously, if your annual value exceeds 150,000, excess becomes deemed income. They abolished that. That is good because very few people have houses with AV of more than 150,000. I can count with my fingers, only the ministers plus a few of you, that's all.